Good morning. The Festival of Art History is happy to welcome you to this 9th edition. This morning we have Lahelma, who is going to make a presentation called August Strindberg, Painter and Photographer. We wish you a very good conference.
So I am going to talk a little bit about August Strindberg as painter and photographer. Of course, you all probably know Strindberg as a playwright and a novelist, but he was also an accomplished painter and photographer, and this talk focuses on that side of his production, his fascinating work in the field of visual arts. In these endeavors, he was informed by both scientific and occultist ideas, and he was motivated by a desire to explore the poetic dimension of nature and nature's creative potential. As I will go on to argue, his experimental paintings and photographs reflect a kind of cosmic vision based on a combination of romantic Naturphilosophie, alchemical ideas, and also the most recent scientific perspectives. He was deeply interested in the role of chance in artistic creativity and in the exploration of nature's creative potential. This talk is actually partly based on an article that appeared last year in this volume called The Occult in Modernist Art, Literature and Cinema, published by Palgrave Macmillan and edited by Henrik Johnson and Tessel Bauduin. Strindberg's interest in occultism is, of course, quite well known, and it has been the subject of a fair amount of scholarship. Yet the impact that his occult ideas had on his artistic practices has been discussed less frequently. This occult inclination, of course, found its most famous expression in the novel Inferno, which was published in 1897. And in this novel, the whole world appears as a network of kind of personal occult symbolism. Around this time, Strindberg had come to a dead end on his path of naturalism, and he had to find a completely new way of perceiving the world in order to be able to write again. I think his experiments in the field of visual art had a decisive role in this endeavor. So his creativity did not come to a standstill during this so-called Inferno period, but his energies were directed into new fields. He became increasingly interested in penetrating the surface of the visible world in order to grasp kind of what goes on underneath it. And that's why he took up painting and photography with increased vigor. And he also published numerous essays that connected his artistic practices with his scientific and occult interests. He employed this combination of occultism and Darwinism in order to construct a theory of artistic hypersensitivity and the evolution of human consciousness. According to this view, the evolution of art, the personal development of the individual, and the evolution of the species were all interconnected. And the development and education of the senses was considered to be the key to this kind of transition towards a higher state of being. So he believed that when our senses become more highly tuned, then the world will appear to us in new ways. In dreams and all kinds of abnormal mental states, such as trance and delirium, when the threshold of sensation is lowered, we can momentarily become aware of this future state of being. So during the course of the 1890s, Strindberg's artistic activities, both in the fields of painting and photography, became increasingly experimental, culminating in the pursuit of revealing the invisible sources of life through chemical investigation that included the use of photographic techniques. Strindberg explored the creative potential of the unconscious mind in his artistic activities, and he also discussed the technique of automatic art in a short essay that he published in 1894 on the role of chance in artistic creation. And in this article, he explained the creation of a work of art as an organic process controlled by creative imagination rather than consciousness. And he referred to a fairy tale about a young boy who encountered a nymph in the woods, which of course in reality was only his imagination playing tricks on him. What he saw was nothing but a tree stump. But Strindberg claimed to have had many similar experiences in which the unconscious mind started to feed into his sensory perceptions. And according to him, this provided an analogy with modern painting. I have a quote from this text here in the original French, written by Strindberg himself. He originally published this article in French, and sometimes his French can be a little bit strange, but I'm sure you can grasp the idea. I will read out the translation in English, so that those of you who might not understand the French so well can also get an idea of what he's saying. At first, one sees nothing but a chaos of colors. Then it begins to assume a likeness. It resembles, but no, it resembles nothing. Suddenly, a point is fixed, like the nucleus of a cell. It increases. The colors are grouping around it, accumulating. Rays are developing that grow branches and twigs like ice crystals do on a window. And the image appears to be to the viewer who has assisted in the act of creating the painting. And what is even better, the painting remains always new. It changes according to light, never wears out, constantly rejuvenated with the gift of life. Strindberg is here writing about a general phenomenon in the art of the period, but he's also referring to his own practices as a painter. And he also offers a very detailed description of the creation of the painting Underlandet, a Wonderland, from 1894, which you can see here. It may or may not be a truthful account of his actual painting process, but it does reveal a great deal about the way he understood the workings of the creative mind. So he explains that he begins with a vague idea of a design of a shadowy wood where you can see the sea at sunset. And then he gets to work distributing the colors with his palette knife. He claimed that he owned no brushes, but some of the finer details in his paintings actually suggest otherwise. So I'm going to read out the English translation again. The canvas is covered. I step back and look. Oh no, I can no longer see the sea. The illuminated opening reveals an infinite perspective of pink and bluish light in which vaporous beings without body or qualification float like fairies with cloud trails. The wood has become a dark underground cave, barred by scrub, And in the foreground, let's see what it is. Rocks covered with unknown lichens. And to the right, the knife has smoothed down the colors too much so that they resemble reflections in water. Well then, it's a pond. Perfect. A touch here and there with the finger, which blends the rebellious colors, melts together and chases away crude tones, refines, evaporates, and the painting is finished. So we can see how the artist sets his imagination in action by a process of alternation between the roles of creator and receiver, and between conscious and unconscious acts. The artwork appears to come into being kind of organically, simulating the creative processes of nature. Yet at the same time, the alternation of roles introduces the artist's conscious control in the process. What is most significant here, I think, is the central role that he gives to the unconscious mind in the creative process. And he's clearly suggesting that the unconscious mind is in contact with some kind of extrasensory reality, and that by allowing it to guide the artistic process, one could imitate nature's creativity. He, for example, employs a metaphor of the nucleus of a cell and describes the creation of the work of art as an organic process in which the viewer assists. These metaphors suggest an association between artistic creativity and the creative processes of nature, which also echoes the dual concept of nature that can be found in the writings of the romantic philosophers. As well as it was also used by late 19th century occultists. And according to this notion, natura naturata is the outward appearance of nature, whereas natura naturans refers to nature's own creativity. So instead of copying nature as it appears, the artist should imitate the creative spirit of nature in order to become united with the divine creativity of God. So in a sense, this is a continuation of his naturalistic approach, but he just takes it one step further. The formula for the art of the future, according to Strindberg, is to imitate nature closely and, above all, to imitate nature's way of creating. And the work of art that is thus created remains always new. It is rejuvenated with the gift of life. And it is forever in a state of becoming, like a living being. And neither its meaning nor even its ontological status are fixed. Similar conceptualizations of the creative process as a merging of the subject and object can be found in late 19th century symbolist art theories. And these were often informed by occult notions, such as the doctrine of correspondences and the idea of an existence of various invisible energies, as well as by modern psychological formulations concerning the dynamic structure of the human mind, with both conscious and unconscious dimensions. Dario Gamboni, in his wonderful book Potential Images from 2002, has compared Strindberg's method to that of Odilon Redon. For both artists, the appearance of the finished work and its effect corresponds to its genesis, which itself illuminates the process of perception and cognition. So artworks that are thus created are always new, as their meanings are not fixed. However, at least for Strindberg, there were different levels of meaning that were kind of hierarchically related. There is an exoteric meaning that can be grasped by everyone, and an esoteric meaning that is understood by the artist himself and the chosen few. In this painting, Wonderland, The exoteric meaning can just be related to the fact that it appears to be a landscape of sorts. While the esoteric meaning is related to a battle between light and darkness. So Strindberg's essay builds on the conception that a work of art does not exist as a thing in itself. The existence of an artwork depends entirely on imagination. It comes into being as a result of an imaginative practice, and its reception is also a process of imaginative perception. This kind of artistic method in which the unconscious mind is allowed to guide the artistic process is more commonly associated with surrealism in the 20th century, when surrealists endeavored to liberate the creative imagination by means of psychic automatisms and trance states. But before it was turned into a systematic artistic approach, this kind of method was employed in mediumistic art. Strindberg was interested in the idea of telepathic communication, for instance, and he was aware of the psychological experimentations carried out to prove the existence of this phenomenon. While in his earlier writing, during his naturalist period, Strindberg had actually considered imagination to be a dangerous hallucinatory force, but we can see that this was no longer the case. The concept of imagination had been the subject of debate throughout the 19th century. The scientifically orientated naturalism that emerged mid-century had rendered the whole idea highly suspicious, and it was understood to be nothing but a mechanical function of the mind. The occult revival, however, contributed to a newly established positive attitude towards the romantic notion of the imagination. For Baudelaire, who provided the late 19th century generation with an aesthetic interpretation of Swedenborg's theory of correspondences, imagination was the queen of faculties, a mysterious gift resembling the creative power of God, and a thing that transformed the artist's vision into a work of art. Baudelaire, of course, defined imagination as the ability to perceive the mystical correspondences between the visible and the invisible worlds. For Baudelaire, as for Strindberg, the imagination was not purely subjective. It was based on an innate universal language that could be communicated directly. The creative imagination, as conceptualized by the Romantics, is in effect the element that transforms the mimetic conception of art into an expressive and creative one. And when this notion developed further in the late 19th century through an increased emphasis on the unconscious, the result was a modern understanding of art as dynamic and extremely powerful, as it had the potential to change one's perception of reality. Strindberg's experimental photographic practices manifest direct parallels with his paintings. Indeed, it is no surprise that someone like Strindberg, who moved freely between the worlds of art and science, would be fascinated with the modern technique of photography. Like other modern technical devices, such as the telescope and the microscope, the camera could reveal things that the naked eye was unable to perceive. Attempts to photograph spirits, fluids, and vibrations thought forms or other invisible phenomena were carried out by occultists and scientists alike. And they often produced highly aesthetic images that artists with occult and symbolist inclinations, such as Strindberg, found both visually and intellectually stimulating. On one level, Strindberg was motivated by the hopes of establishing scientific proof for occult phenomena, but he was equally fascinated by the artistic potential of photography. As I have already explained, Strindberg's desire to explore the interplay of passive and active elements of the creative process was reflected in his paintings. Photography, due to its passive character of mechanical reproduction, would kind of appear to remain on the surface level of things. Yet for Strindberg, it was precisely the passive element in creativity that was able to imitate nature's way of creating. That is the natura naturans aspect. And hence, it could penetrate beneath the surface. Strindberg distrusted all kinds of lenses, and he preferred to use simple self-made devices. In the case of these so-called celestographs and crystallograms, he opted for direct exposure without using any kind of mechanical apparatus or even a lens. Similar experimental methods were employed in both scientific and occultist photography, which endeavored to record invisible phenomena. So Strindberg noticed that when brine solutions were left to evaporate on sheets of glass, the residue would create crystal formations that resembled various plant forms, such as ferns, grass, or tree branches. And you can see one example of this kind of a photogram here. And it seemed to him that these crystal formations were imitating living matter. The photogram was then created by laying the glass on a photographic paper and making an exposure. And here's an example of these so-called celestographs, which were made by exposing a photographic plate directly to the night sky. The image that appeared as a result was not a photograph of the night sky in any conventional sense. Its visual resemblance to the sky dotted with the light of heavenly bodies was in effect incidental, probably formed by microscopic particles in the air and impurities in the chemical process. But to Strindberg, this appeared as a confirmation of his occult vision of the universe in which the microcosm and macrocosm corresponded with each other. Strindberg discovered in photography a very fruitful medium for exploring the relationship between art, science, and occultism. And when he pointed the camera towards himself, questions of subjectivity, the existence of the soul, and life and death were introduced into this interplay of ideas. When Strindberg first began photographing himself, he was motivated, at least in part, by the need to take control over his public image. And in 1886, he produced a series of photographs of himself and his family at their home in Gersau, Switzerland. Little is known of the photographic process itself, and we can never be sure who it was that actually took the picture. And this is also true of his later photographic self-portraits. Occasionally he may have been assisted by his wife, for example, but at least in some cases he used a delayed shutter. In any case, it was certainly always Strindberg himself who staged the photographs and directed the process. It is also clear that these photographs were staged. The technology of the period was not yet even advanced enough to allow for the possibility of spontaneous snapshots. And as you can see, there is a lot of conscious role-playing taking place. But these images nonetheless reflect a belief in the objective and naturalistic potential of photography. In his later photographic self-portraits, Strindberg assumed an approach that was in stark contrast with the one that he had developed in the Gersau series. Rather than offering multiple perspectives and details, Strindberg's later photographic self-portraits endeavored to reveal the essence of his own being through a process of distillation in which the individualizing layers were removed in order to reveal the core of his subjectivity. His experiments with the celesterographs and crystallograms reveal, however, that he still believed in the potential of photography to provide objective evidence. Strindberg was aware of contemporary attempts to capture the human soul using simple photographic techniques, very similar to the methods he employed himself. He was interested, for example, in thought transfer, and he also believed that photographs could have a telepathic power. This was by no means an unusual conviction in the late 19th century cultural environment that Strindberg inhabited. In 1905, he started to work together with the Swedish photographer Herman Andersson, and with his help, he was finally able to fulfill his long-standing dream of life-sized photography. The images were achieved either by rephotographing and enlarging existing photographic images, or as you can see here, by using the so-called Wunderkamera, a pinhole camera with no lens. As you can remember, he distrusted lenses. Strindberg's friend Gustav Eisen, who visited him during this period of collaboration with Herman Andersson, found his whole apartment full of photographs. According to Eisen, Strindberg was assured that in the photographs of himself taken with the Wunderkamera, his soul came out better than in those taken by other people. The portraits produced by Strindberg during this period reflect the same idea of a close contact between the image and the object that he had already been exploring in the photograms of crystallization. His reliance on photographic techniques that were informed by occult ideas resulted in a highly artistic conception of the photographic image, and indeed in images that have unquestionable artistic value. He employed experimental methods in order to minimize all naturalistic details and to reveal the essence of the subject. And this approach reflects the modernist attitude favored by the circle of artists with whom Strindberg socialized, who reacted against the naturalist principle of attention to detail. This kind of visual practice, as we have seen, makes use of unconscious processes and leaves room for the creative imagination of both the artist and the perceiver. The tension between the subject and the object, the individual and the universal, that is revealed in Strindberg's photography during and after the 1890s reflects occultist and psychological discourses concerning the structure of the human mind. The essence of one's being is no longer situated in the visible, but precisely in what cannot be seen. Similarly to his paintings, Strindberg's photographs explore the borderline between the material and the immaterial. The object status of a photograph is of course far more questionable than that of a drawing or a painting, which always remains insistently material, while a photograph is an object that lies somewhere between materiality and immateriality. As an object made of light, it is in this sense completely immaterial, but its indexical quality, its tendency to always point towards an original, connects it with the physical world in a very concrete sense. This is an issue, of course, that has become more acute during the era of digital images, but it has always been a fundamental element of photography. In Strindberg's photographic portrait, this element of immateriality is combined with a very strong sense of presence. Indeed, the magic of photography, as Strindberg perceived it, would allow the person in the image to be truly present, no less present than if he were there in person, or perhaps even more so. According to his beliefs based on monistic philosophy, there was no real distinction between matter and spirit, and hence no reason why the immaterial essence of a living being could not be captured in a material object. A photographic image which already exists on the borderline could therefore serve as a perfect instrument for this kind of experimentation. The abstract, non-mimetic quality of the celestographs is immediately apparent, but Strindberg's figurative photographs from the 1890s onwards also manifest the same tendency that transforms the photographic image into a symbolic and expressive medium with the potential to represent feelings and ideas. There has been a tendency to view Strindberg's artistic production as completely original and isolated from the rest of the art world. If anything, he has been considered an unwitting precursor of 20th century abstraction. Yet Strindberg's lifelong interest in visual art is well documented, and we know that he was intimately involved in the artistic circles of Stockholm, Paris, and Berlin, socializing with some of the leading artists of the period, such as Paul Gauguin and Edvard Munch. It has also been suggested that some of Strindberg's working methods, such as his rudimentary technique and his tendency to use palette knives instead of brushes, were at least to some extent due to his lack of formal training as an artist. Hence, in purely stylistic terms, his work may appear to diverge quite radically from that of most artists of the period. Yet, if we take into consideration the theoretical ideas that guided his practices, he will no longer seem so isolated. Fellow artists like Munch and Gauguin probably influenced Strindberg in his conception of visual art and creativity. Harry G. Carlson has provided one of the most insightful approaches to Strindberg's artistic production, although his focus is on his reawakening as a dramatist after the Inferno period. According to Carlson, Strindberg had always felt that as a visual artist, he had greater freedom to use his imagination. Carlson maintains that the experimental artistic practices that Strindberg engaged with during the Inferno period made him aware of the creative power of the imagination, which allowed him to discover a new approach in his work as a dramatist. Yet, Strindberg's artistic practices should not be considered merely an instrument that enabled him to pursue new paths in his writing. So my aim here has been to demonstrate that his artistic production is valuable in its own right, and that in order to understand it, we must examine his art within the late 19th and early 20th century context, in which artistic, scientific, and occult ideas often collided. In both his painterly and photographic practices, Strindberg was motivated by the very modern pursuit of expressing the inexpressible and revealing the invisible. And this was a mission shared by modern artists, occultists, and scientists alike. A recent scholarship has emphasized the importance of the occult revival and also emerging psychological theories in the formation of the aesthetic program of symbolism. And there has also been a tendency to re-examine the relationship between symbolism and modernism. Already in her pioneering 1979 study, Phyllis Ada Burhan defined symbolist art as a symbolic representation that reveals a correspondence between the artist's subjective emotional state and a larger totality of nature. And this is an interaction that can be conceptualized in psychological as well as occultist terms. Both emphasize the subjective nature of vision and the ability of the human mind to operate with visual symbols. As I have argued here, a similar interaction between subjectivity and nature informs Strindberg's understanding of the artistic process. It is important to keep in mind that although he emphasized the role of chance, his working methods were not haphazard as they have sometimes been described. Even when he allowed chance to take control of the process, it was not understood as a random force. According to his belief system, every single detail of our existence had meaning for those who were able to decipher the messages they conveyed. So while there is no denying that Strindberg's artistic endeavors were always highly original, they also find parallels in the art of the period. His art takes part in the questioning of established norms of pictorial representation that has continued throughout the history of modern art. And this has resulted in new forms of artistic expression, such as conceptual art, performance, or installations, which emphasize the creative process instead of the material object and ascribe an active role to the viewer. Hence, in order to appreciate the art historical significance of Strindberg's artistic production, we must go beyond the visual appearance. Instead of considering him as an isolated genius and a forerunner of abstraction, it is more fruitful to perceive Strindberg as a central representative of late 19th century occult modernism. As with many other artists associated with the symbolist current, he drew inspiration from a wide spectrum of scientific and occult sources. In both his paintings and photographs, Strindberg reflected on the subjective and objective dimensions of art and explored the interrelationship between the insistent materiality of the work of art and its spiritual dimensions. In his formulation of the creative process, the rational and conscious self is temporarily lost, but this loosening of control allows the individual to reach contact with a larger, more fundamental level of being. This model of artistic creativity, in which the creative imagination is fed by unconscious impulses, was typical of late 19th century symbolist theory, and it does still prevail, although it may no longer be articulated in occultist terms. Before I open the floor to some questions, I will just take this opportunity to advertise a research project that I am currently a member of. It is called Uuden etsijät in Finnish, Seekers of the New in English. And it is a research project on esotericism and religious transformation in Finland during the era of modernization. And it is a multidisciplinary project. exploring the cultural history of Finnish esotericism. And you can find us online. You can see the address there, and you can also follow us on Facebook. We just did a very wonderful conference in Turku, Finland, on esotericism and mysticism, and there will be a publication that follows. It was co-organized together with the Donner Institute, which is a research institute focusing on religious research, and they also host the largest esoteric library in the Nordic countries. So if you are interested in that sort of thing, you can follow our activities online. But now I think we have time for a couple of questions. If you are going to ask questions in French, then let me know, and I will use those, because I'm not willing to rely on my knowledge of French. I can probably understand the question, but I won't be able to answer it in French. Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm Marja Sakari. I come from Atheneum in Helsinki. I'm the director of the museum. Thank you, Marja. It was really very, very nice talk and very interesting. But I was wondering, because actually at the end of 19th century, so there were also on the level of psychology quite a lot of things happening and questions about the unconscious and conscious and so on and so forth. So do you think that August Strindberg was aware of those movements as well, and what was his relationship to psychology?
Yes, thank you for that. That was a very good question, and I kind of emphasized the occult side here, but Strindberg was definitely also aware of these psychological theories. He read Theodore Ribot, for example, but it's quite interesting how these artists interpreted the scientific writings. So they didn't read them in the manner that we would understand scientific psychology today. They kind of read them and interpreted them through an occult perspective, or an artistic perspective, perhaps is a better way to explain it. So it was something that they could use for their creative production. But Strindberg, of course, was also very much interested in science as such, and he did all these also these chemical experiments, and then he published them. Some of them even got published in like scientific journals, but most were published in occult journals. He was also very interested in the work of Ernst Haeckel and the monistic philosophy. So he had all these kinds of interests that may seem very different to us from today's perspective, but in his mind they were all connected.
Hello. First, thank you very much. You talked a little bit about the links between Odilon Redon and Strindberg works. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about it, because I don't remember from Odilon Redon if he did any research on the occult. And but he had a very deep interest in nature and evolution. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, please. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. Yeah, I was actually, when I mentioned Redon, I was referring to Dario Gamboni's research. So he has made that comparison, but it also, of course, because I referred to it, it makes sense to me. So it's not a visual resemblance, but it's certainly seem to have a similar idea about how creativity works and how it's connected to natural processes. And I think Rodin also had this similar kind of idea that Strindberg had, that he was interested in nature and evolution and things like that, but he also read them through this perspective that I suppose can be described as occult. Although it was very typical for artists of the period that they didn't necessarily commit themselves to any kind of movements or any kind of like religious systems, but they would sort of shop around for ideas. Some of them scientific, some of them occult. Not sure if it answers your question, but
Thank you, yes, for this talk. Following this question about Odilon Redon, I was wondering, as Odilon de Redon was very appreciated by the surrealists, as you say, I was wondering if the surrealists knew how much they knew about August Strindberg's work at that time, because it's true that there is a relationship, a link, very clear in between the automatism in Strindberg work and the surrealist work.
yes, that is also a very good question. Actually, I don't know. I don't suppose they knew very much about. There may be some like indirect links between Strindberg and the surrealists, but I don't think there is a direct connection. But perhaps further research will reveal that there is. Only quite recently there has been this like kind of new wave of research also in the connection between surrealism and occultism, and there's still quite a lot of work that needs to be done. But in any case, I believe that there are kind of stronger links between these 19th century ideas and then 20th century art, but they haven't been properly researched as of yet. But surrealism was never very big in Sweden. There was, of course, a surrealist movement, but it came a little bit later on, and I don't think that had, at least in the Swedish context, there probably wasn't a very strong connection between Strindberg. I would suppose that they thought Strindberg was perhaps a little bit old-fashioned by then. But of course, well, in the field of his like dramatic work, like the dream play, there is a direct connection between surrealism and Strindberg. So perhaps also some of his artistic ideas could have sort of perhaps they went through his dramatic work, because at least as Harry G. Carlson has argued, this artistic experimentation had a huge impact then on the way that he started to think about writing after the Inferno period. But yeah, interesting question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. Brilliant. Coming back to your reference, potential images, do you have in mind some references you could share with us in those periods about photography?
So you mean potential images in the
sense that they are later?
Yes. Well, in photography, I was kind of making reference to these attempts to photograph spirits, where you may have something in the background, but it's impossible to see exactly what it is. And I think Gamboni in his book also makes this reference and this connection. But I think the idea of potential images also is very closely connected to his paintings, where you're never quite sure what it is that you are looking at.
References about other artists? Sorry. Yes, thank you. I was also thinking about other artists or writers or whatever in the cultural period who would also be acting in this field of potential images, besides Strindberg.
Well, if you read Gamboni's book, then you will find lots of references. But he mentions Redon, for example, and also Gauguin, who has these, like, often in the background, for example, there are these shapes that appear almost abstract. So in Gamboni's interpretation, it is a kind of a central feature of art. It's something that runs through the history of art, but then it kind of culminates during this period.
Yeah, I go back to the influences that August Strindberg might have had, because at that time also the theosophical ideas were very strong, and there were a lot of artists who really followed the theosophical way of thinking, and also the whole theosophy. They had a lot of visual thinking as well, like Annie Besant and Leadbeater, who made the book about thought forms and so on. So did he have any connection to theosophy, or was he more influenced by Swedenborg and these kinds of, and denied the theosophical thing?
Yes. Well, at least he was a little bit suspicious about theosophy in its, like, modern formulation. He didn't much care for Madame Blavatsky, but that might be something to do with her being a woman. But then at the same time, he was employing many of the same ideas. So yeah, it's a slightly complicated issue, because if we trust what he himself said, then he didn't care for theosophy at all. But then if we read what he actually wrote, he did very much use the same ideas. Okay, thank you very much for all these wonderful questions. Thank you.